Glenn Ford was once the golden face of Hollywood in the 1940s to 1960s. With more than 100 roles spanning 5 decades, he shared the screen with Marlon Brando, Bette Davis, and Rita Hayworth, and became the #1 box office star in 1958. But if you only see the glory, you will never truly see the man he was. Throughout his life, Glenn loved one woman until his last breath, yet never married her. He had a son but left her behind for nearly half a century. He married 4 times, had affairs with hundreds of stars, yet in the end, his son had to go to court to stop a nurse from placing a do not resuscitate order on his hospital bed. He created iconic performances in Gilda, The Big Heat, and Blackboard Jungle, but died quietly alone in a hospital room. No one seemed to care about Glenn Ford. He wasn't a bad man, but he wasn't the kind of man everyone would want as a father, a husband, or a lover. And it was precisely that, the inner contradictions, the irreversible mistakes, that made him one of the most tragic and complex figures in Hollywood history, a legend who never spoke until his son wrote everything down. Glenn Ford was born on May 1st, 1916, in the town of Portneuf, Quebec, Canada, with a long and formal name, Gwilyn Samuel Newton Ford. The blood in his veins was anything but ordinary. His father was a cousin of Canada's first Prime Minister, Sir John Macdonald, while his mother's side descended from Martin Van Buren, the 8th President of the United States. From birth, Glenn stood between 2 worlds, one rooted in tradition and status, the other chasing dreams beyond borders. In 1924, when Glenn was just 8 years old, his family left Canada and settled in Santa Monica, California, a decision that would shape the rest of his life. There, beneath the golden sun of the Pacific coast, the Canadian-born boy first set foot on stage in school plays at Santa Monica High School. Glenn felt for the first time the magnetic pull of becoming someone else, living inside another person's story. And perhaps from that moment, he also learned how to hide his own. After graduating in 1934, Glenn joined small theater groups along the West Coast. He had no money, but he had the hands of a laborer. When he wasn't acting, he worked as an electrician, a construction worker, learned carpentry, and fixed up his family's home. His father, a stern railroad executive, insisted he learn a trade just in case Hollywood didn't need him. What no one predicted was that Hollywood did need Glenn Ford, just not the real man himself, but the image of the ideal man audiences wanted to believe in. In 1937, he auditioned for 20th Century Fox but was rejected. A year later, he failed again, but he didn't give up. Then came Columbia Pictures, turning the name Glenn Ford from a small Canadian town into a symbol on the American silver screen. In 1939, Glenn Ford officially signed a long-term contract with Columbia Pictures, a bold yet calculated move by the studio's head, Harry Kahn. Instead of buying stars from other studios as he had done before, Kahn decided to cultivate Columbia's own generation of actors. Glenn was chosen, alongside one other name, William Holden. Harry Kahn bluntly declared, "One of them will make it, the other will be eaten alive." What he didn't expect was that the two would become close friends and rise to stardom together. Glenn's first leading role came in Film Heaven with a barbed wire fence, but it was far from a smooth start. Director Ricardo Cortez openly mocked him on set, calling him a lousy actor and swearing never to work with him again. Years later, Glenn ran into him at a restaurant and nearly punched him, the old grudge still burning. But Hollywood is a place where one breakthrough can change everything, and for Glenn Ford, that moment came in 1946 when he and Rita Hayworth entered cinema legend with the film Gilda. Rita was a sex symbol of her time, while Glenn, with his understated quiet style, was the perfect counterbalance. While most of the spotlight fell on Rita, Glenn's performance left a lasting impression on audiences. From that film onward, the two entered into a relationship that was ambiguous, haunting, and would stretch across 4 decades. After Gilda, Glenn's career took off. He appeared in a string of classic films. The Big Heat 1953, as a noir detective, a role that earned him an Oscar nomination. Blackboard Jungle 1955, as a teacher in a chaotic school alongside Sidney Poitier, pioneering the genre of educational dramas. Tea House of the August Moon 1956, a satirical comedy with Marlon Brando. 310 to Yuma 1957, and Cowboy 1958, affirming his talent in westerns thanks to real-life skills in horseback riding and shooting. In 1958, Glenn Ford became the #1 box office star in America, a rare honor for an actor who avoided flamboyance, major scandals, and always maintained a calm, low-key presence. The 1960s brought a mix of films in terms of quality, but Glenn stayed the course with roles in Cimarron, 1960, The Courtship of Eddie's Father, 1963, The Rounders, 1965, and Heaven with a Gun, 1969. As the cinematic spotlight began to dim, he transitioned to television, finding continued success with series like Cad's County, The Family HVAC, and Once an Eagle throughout the 1970s. His final cinematic high point came with a brief yet deeply moving cameo as Jonathan Kent, the adoptive father of Superman, in Superman, the movie 1978. No complex lines, no grand gestures, just a look, and once again Glenn reached the audience's heart, embodying steadiness, grace, and quiet compassion. In his later years, he took on a few minor roles, such as in Day of the Assassin, 1979, but everyone understood that the golden age of Glenn Ford had passed. Ahead of him lay the shadows of things unredeemed, the woman he loved, the son he once abandoned, and the self he never fully forgave. When America entered World War II, many stars chose to serve their country by selling war bonds or performing for the troops. Glenn Ford did the same, until one day on the set of Destroyer, 1943, he suddenly told the director, "I can't keep just playing a soldier." And with that, he volunteered for the United States Marine Corps Reserve. The decision shocked Hollywood. Harry Kahn, the head of Columbia Pictures, was furious. He was in the middle of building Glenn into the studio's top star, but Glenn chose to go. He wanted to be a soldier, not just pretend to be one on screen. Yet life didn't give him a full heroic arc. After being assigned to the Marine Corps' Public Relations Division, Glenn soon faced serious health problems. Doctors discovered he had a duodenal ulcer, a condition that caused severe pain and forced him into the hospital for 5 months, making him unfit for deployment. For someone who deeply longed to prove his real worth, it was a silent disappointment he never spoke about. After being discharged in 1944, he returned to film, but even though he never saw combat, Glenn Ford always took pride in having served. He continued in the Naval Reserve, eventually reaching the rank of lieutenant commander, and was given responsibilities in military media and cultural outreach. Nearly half a century later, in 1992, Glenn was awarded the Legion of Honor by the French government, their highest recognition for aiding civilians fleeing the Nazis during the war. Not with a weapon, but through his image, his spirit, and his alignment with justice. Through films, fundraising tours, and humanitarian work in the post-war years, he may not have fired a gun in battle, but Glenn Ford carried that soldier's code with him for the rest of his life, calm, responsible, and sometimes too solitary to ask for help. But while the military recognized him as a dedicated serviceman, in his personal life, he was a man who couldn't hold on to anyone. His glow inspired admiration, but that very glow also pushed loved ones away, and that marked the beginning of another tragedy, quiet, enduring, and more profound than any battlefield. Love, marriage, and a father-son bond that never truly healed. In 1940, Glenn Ford first starred opposite a captivating young actress in the film The Lady in Question. Her name was Rita Hayworth. At the time, neither of them was famous yet. Both were just beginning their careers. But between them, there was something beyond performance, a natural chemistry, a cinematic electricity that flickered in glances and lingered in silence on the screen. 6 years later, when they reunited in Gilda in 1946, both had matured in talent and in emotion. Gilda became legendary, and between them, an unnamed love began. Glenn once said, "I never saw Gilda as a movie. It was a memory." And Rita, surrounded by fame and loneliness, found in Glenn something she had always lacked, quiet protection. But timing stood in their way. When Glenn was single, Rita was married to Edward Judson. When Rita divorced, Glenn had already married Eleanor Powell. Then came her marriages to Orson Welles and Prince Ali Khan. They were always out of sync, yet they never stopped finding their way back to each other. But for Glenn, then entering the golden years of his career, her devotion wasn't enough to keep him grounded. While Eleanor poured her soul into their family, Glenn fell into a string of extramarital affairs. From co-stars on set to fleeting romances, no one knows the exact count. But according to Peter Ford, his father recorded over 140 private conversations with various Hollywood starlets, including Judy Garland, Marilyn Monroe, Joan Crawford, Geraldine Brooks. There were no violent fights, no public breakdowns, but what hurt Eleanor most was a long, unexplained coldness in that grand three-story house. They lived in silent, separate worlds. Eleanor lived upstairs, Glenn stayed on the ground floor, and their son Peter lived in the middle with his grandmother, Hannah, a family of three under one roof. Yet none touched the world of the other. Peter would later recall, "My father didn't hug me, didn't talk to my mother. He just appeared when he had to, then vanished." After 16 years of a marriage that wasn't truly a marriage, Eleanor quietly filed for divorce in 1959, just as Peter turned 14. Glenn signed the papers without resistance. Eleanor took her son with her, but never the heart of the man she had once given up the world for. For the next 23 years, Eleanor never remarried, never loved anyone else. She quietly devoted herself to charity, raising her son and engaging in religious work, as if the rest of her life was spent atoning for love that arrived at the wrong time with the wrong man. When she died in 1982 from cancer, her ashes were placed in a simple brass urn at Hollywood Forever Cemetery. No grand service, no media presence. Only Peter was there, the boy she once called the only reason to keep going. Glenn didn't attend the funeral. Maybe he was too busy, or maybe he didn't know how to face it. Among the hundreds of women who passed through Glenn Ford's life, only one child carried his name. But that child, Peter Newton Ford, grew up in a house where his father was little more than a shadow. After Eleanor Powell filed for divorce in 1959, she was granted custody. Glenn didn't contest it. He also didn't stay in touch throughout Peter's formative years. Glenn was almost entirely absent. No letters, no phone calls, no advice. When his son first faced the world, Peter once said, "He was my father biologically, but he wasn't there. My father loved women, loved his work, loved everything except being a father." Glenn sent a modest monthly support check, just enough to avoid being labeled irresponsible, but never enough to fill the void of an empty childhood. While he starred in films as courageous men and devoted fathers, Peter lived with his mother and grandmother in a house where the past never quite rested. Even more bitter was the fact that Glenn and Peter often worked together, especially on the television series Cadds County during the 1970s. But on set, they were two colleagues, more distant than strangers. No hugs, no shared meals after filming, no proud glance from a father to his son. And then time did what no one could stop. Glenn grew old. After a series of strokes, he lost the ability to walk. His memory began to fail. He needed a wheelchair and became completely dependent on others. It was during this period that he called Peter back, not as a son, but simply as someone he needed help from. But now, under one roof again, there were no longer separate floors, just a broken father and a son trying to make sense of his life, surrounded by the sound of medical machines and the fragments of a fading memory. Peter began asking. Glenn began telling stories no one had heard, affairs long hidden, fears never confessed, a life lived to the fullest, but never lived truthfully with the only person who called him Dad. In a later interview, Peter recalled, "For the first time, my father looked at me for a long time, then said, 'Do you remember when you were little?' And that's when I knew he was trying to make things right, late but sincere." After Glenn's death, Peter published a memoir, Glenn Ford, A Life in 2011, not to condemn, not to seek revenge, but to tell the story his father had chosen to keep hidden his entire life. A man once admired by the whole world, once loved by the most beautiful women, but in the end, he could only ask the son he had once abandoned to write for him 2 words he could never say for himself: understood. At the height of his fame, Glenn Ford was a man Hollywood deeply respected. But in his final years, he was no longer the Glenn Ford the public once knew. No more steady gaze, no upright posture, no sharp memory or warm, grounded smile. After turning 70, Glenn began to suffer a series of strokes, each one more severe than the last. His nervous system deteriorated, his memory started to blur, and his body no longer obeyed him. Once a man who strode confidently across film sets, He now relied on a wheelchair, completely dependent on others. During this time, Glenn didn't live with his son, but instead with Pauline Kernan, a much younger private nurse hired for full-time care. But things soon turned suspicious. According to Peter Ford, his father completely trusted Pauline. Glenn had updated his will, leaving the majority of his estate to her, striking out nearly all family members. The breaking point came when Peter discovered that Pauline had placed a Do Not Resuscitate (DNR) order outside Glenn's hospital room, despite Glenn still being lucid, communicative, and clearly wanting to live. Peter had to go to court, not to fight over money, but to fight for his father's right to stay alive. After the hearing, the DNR order was revoked, the care terms revised, and Pauline was removed as Glenn's medical proxy. It wasn't just a legal battle. It was a final confrontation between a son and the looming shadow of a father who had been emotionally distant his entire life. After the ordeal, Glenn personally asked Peter and his family to move in with him. At that point, he was no longer a screen legend, no longer a charming lover, no longer a neglectful father. He was just an old man, frail, diminished, clinging to what little remained in the one embrace that had finally opened to him. Glenn lived a few more years in quiet. He stopped acting, stopped giving interviews, stopped writing. In the Beverly Hills home, once a sanctuary of love with Rita, once echoing with Peter's childhood laughter, there was now only the sound of wheels on tile, the soft hum of a breathing machine, and sighs fading like mist at the end of a day. At 4 p.m. on August 30th, 2006, Glenn Ford passed away in silence. He was 90. There was no grand funeral, no sweeping farewell from Hollywood, but by personal request, the ashes of his beloved dog Bismar, the loyal four-legged companion who had always slept by his bedside, were buried with him at Woodland Cemetery in Santa Monica. A peaceful ending, but not a light-hearted one, because to the audience, he would always be a symbol. But to himself, his entire life may have been a long journey in search of one thing: forgiveness from the women he loved, the son he left behind, and the man he never fully made peace with. Glenn Ford was never a loud star. He didn't act with grand gestures, didn't wave his arms on screen, and didn't play the publicity game in real life. And it was precisely because of that Glenn became the kind of actor an entire generation of American audiences once trusted, empathized with, and saw as a reflection of themselves. He played the teacher in Blackboard Jungle, the cop in The Big Heat, the Western farmer in Cowboy, the father in Superman. In each role, he didn't overwhelm the audience. He made them feel close, safe, and quietly heartbroken when he failed. Critics once called Glenn Ford the ordinary man in extraordinary circumstances. He wasn't Clark Gable, nor was he Marlon Brando or James Dean, but he was Glenn Ford, the scene partner everyone wanted to work with, the kind of man every viewer believed was real. Over a career that spanned more than 50 years, Glenn Ford starred in over 100 films across nearly every genre. Film noir, Gilda, The Big Heat; social drama, Blackboard Jungle, The Doctor and the Girl; westerns, 310 to Yuma, The Fastest Gun Alive, Jubal; comedies, The Tea House of the August Moon, The Courtship of Eddie's Father; and even superhero films, Superman, the movie 1978. In 1958, he was the #1 box office star in America, a title few actors held for more than a year. He held it for 4. But the bitter truth is, not many remember Glenn Ford today. There's no towering tribute on Hollywood Boulevard, no grand memorial after his death, no revival campaigns for his classic films like those devoted to Humphrey Bogart or John Wayne. In one interview, Peter Ford said, "My father was incredibly famous until he died." And then, within months, his name faded from Hollywood conversations. Perhaps it was because Glenn never courted controversy. No scandals, no public meltdowns, no tragic end like so many other icons. Glenn Ford left this world the same way he lived in it. Quietly, steadfastly, and without begging to be remembered. And it's that very quality that makes him worthy of remembrance, because his legacy doesn't lie in statues or ceremonies. It lives in every scene where he didn't act, but simply existed. A lingering glance, a restrained line, a man who was never perfect but achingly, hauntingly real. Glenn Ford never tried to become a legend. He didn't fight to be remembered. didn't step onto stage to dazzle, and never used his pain to manipulate public attention. And yet, that's exactly why he became one of the hardest artists to forget. Once you sit quietly and look behind the curtain, his life was a series of contradictions between love and distance, between light and shadow, between the man admired by the public and the man his family never fully understood. He loved one woman for 40 years but could never marry her, abandoned his only child only to return begging for forgiveness when time was nearly gone, reached the pinnacle of fame, and then faded into obscurity without fanfare. Hollywood may have forgotten his name. The films that made him famous may now sit in storage. But if you've ever watched Gilda, ever been moved by his gaze in The Big Heat, ever felt his presence in Blackboard Jungle, ever felt reassured seeing him as Superman's father, then you've already touched a piece of Glenn Ford's legacy. A legacy not of titles, not of medals, but a simple knowledge that a man like that once existed, quiet, resilient, and full of unseen scars. If you believe that legends like Glenn Ford, those who stayed true to themselves until the very end, deserve to be remembered, understood, and honored, then share this story. Have you ever seen a Glenn Ford film? What do you remember about him? Leave us a comment so his name doesn't vanish into silence. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more untold, unforgettable stories about the legends you love.